afternoon. My name's Jonathan Rash. I work for the Indian Health Service in California area in our office in Sacramento. And I'm going to be giving you an introduction to the Sanitation Deficiency System, or SDS. You're going to hear me saying SDS a lot, SDS, SDS. So when I'm talking about SDS, that is the Sanitation Deficiency System. That's what we're talking about today. Here's an overview of what we're going to be discussing. I'm going to kind of go over what it is, what's the point of it, why do we do it. I'm going to talk about the process of how we put projects into SDS, which is a collaborative process between IHS and the tribes. I'm going to talk about how projects in SDS are scored and prioritized for funding, about funding trends that we've seen over the last several years, and how funds are distributed. And I'm going to give you some tips on how to give the best, your tribal projects the best chance possible of getting funding through SDS, and sort of also a timeline of how the process goes. Maybe, possibly, I might have time to kind of go live into SDS. I'm not really sure we're going to have time for that, but if things end early and we have a volunteer, we might be able to actually open up an SDS project and look at it live. But I'm not really anticipating that's very likely, but I'll leave it open as a possibility. So I'm going to start off just giving you an introduction to SDS. What is it? So SDS is a prioritized list of deficiencies. So everything in SDS has two aspects of it. There's a deficiency for drinking water, wastewater, or solid waste for tribal systems. And then there is a project to correct that deficiency. SDS, the Sanitation Deficiency System, is required by Congress, specifically under the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. I'm going to tell you more about that in the next slide. This SDS database and process of putting projects into this database is used by the Indian Health Service to allocate what we call our regular funding for water, sewer, or solid waste projects. EPA also uses SDS to allocate their clean water Indian set aside, and that's specifically only for wastewater projects. Well, SDS is not used by the EPA drinking water program. That's a separate process. However, EPA, whenever they see a project submitted for EPA drinking water tribal set-aside funding, they're going to say, is that project in SDS? They typically expect to see those projects in SDS. Now, a really key thing about SDS projects is, if you think about many grant programs, you might need to submit, and if you don't get funded, you resubmit the next year and so forth. But SDS projects don't work that way. Whenever something is input into SDS, it persists in the system. You don't need to reapply every year. Now, you might want to update information every year, and there are some aspects you need to do, but the project is going to stay in the system until either the problem is solved or the tribe indicates they don't really want it in the system anymore. Starting this year, we're working under new SDS guidelines on a national level throughout all of Indian Health Service. And whatever I'm presenting to you today is going to be talking about SDS under these new guidelines. So what I have here, here's some text I copied and pasted out of the 1988 amendments to Public Law 94-437, the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. I'm not going to read all this, but I would really encourage you all to read it. I have a link here, and you can download on the conference website. There's a copy of this presentation, and you can download it, and you can click on this hyperlink, and you can read this law, particularly pages 68 to 70 that refers to this, because there's a lot of information there you might not be aware of that the Indian Health Service has to do for tribes. But one of the things I wanted to point out here, specifically here on the bottom of this section, part 5 of section 302, it is in the interest of the United States, and it is the policy of the United States, that all Indian communities and Indian homes, new and existing, be provided with safe and adequate water supply systems and sanitary sewage waste disposal systems as soon as possible. This language entered the law in 1988 with some amendments to the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. And this is, I think, a real kind of bolstering of the whole purpose of the sanitation facilities construction program of the Indian Health Service. So what kind of projects do we have in SDS? So we have drinking water projects. They can be community, community-wide systems or individual single home systems like wells. Wastewater projects, again, for a whole community or an individual septic system or that sort of thing. Solid waste infrastructure, such as transfer stations, potentially even landfills. Cleanup of open dumps. Our authority for that comes under a different law, but we do have open dump cleanups. The projects are really primarily for construction or dump cleanups, maybe a little bit of planning costs. We can include minor amounts of operation and maintenance costs. There's a lot of limitations on that. It can be training for whatever we're building, O&M manuals. We really cannot ever pay for operator salaries or electricity bills or that kind of thing. So that's what's in SDS. What is not in SDS would be other types of water projects. We don't do stormwater drainage. We don't do irrigation. We don't do projects only for commercial or institutional types of facilities. We don't do anything like environmental remediation. Every project in SDS has to have a construction component. You can't put something in only requesting planning. I'm going to talk more about that in detail later in this presentation. You can't have a project only for O&M costs. Typically, O&M costs are only allowable as a small part of a larger construction project. And finally, we do not allow projects for future growth. Like our community is growing. We're anticipating 20 more new homes next year. We need a bigger storage tank to accommodate those 20 new homes. That would not go into SDS because those 20 homes are not on the ground yet. SDS is for existing homes, not for homes that aren't there yet. I want to talk more about that here. So SDS projects really are only to serve existing homes that are on the ground right now. If you have new homes being planned, like that example I just gave, hey, we're building a subdivision of 20 new homes, IHS has a different pot of funds for those. It's called the IHS Housing Fund. That's a different process. That's a different way to get those funds. I'm not talking about that today. Maybe I can discuss it a little bit at the end if we have time for questions and answers. But again, I want to emphasize SDS projects have to be to serve existing native homes. If the homes are under a housing authority, which means they were built with HUD, the HASA funds, or some other HUD housing program, even including CDBG, and they haven't been conveyed yet, then they may not be eligible to receive funds through SDS. But there's some exceptions to that. And it's without going into a lot of detail on what those exceptions were, HUD has a responsibility to put in their own water and wastewater facilities for the homes that they build. However, if you have a community of a bunch of homes, let's say some of them are existing homes, some of them are HUD homes, under a housing authority, and you have a problem that was not caused by those HUD homes, such as, the well controls went down and we need new well controls. Well, those HUD homes didn't cause that problem. So in certain circumstances, they can be considered to be eligible. Other users, such as non-native homes, commercial facilities, government facilities, governmental offices, that sort of thing, are not eligible. And so that's something that comes up a lot. You have a community where you have a good number of homes, but you may also have a commercial enterprise here, tribal buildings over here. Those non-native homes, basically anything that's not a native home, are not eligible, and therefore we have to have a cost share based on how much water or how much wastewater is being generated or how much water is being used. And all of the homes all the native homes that we're serving that are eligible need to be shown in our home inventory tracking system, or HITS. So wait a minute, cost share, what are we talking about here? Yes, I did say cost share. So if you have a project in SDS that it serves a mix of eligible native homes and ineligible users, whether they're homes with non-native occupants or they are, you know, commercial facilities or government buildings or whatever, then we need to have, for Indian Health Service funds, we need to have an ineligible cost share to make up that, you know, those non-native homes. It can be travel funds. Maybe you can get some other source of, you know, grants. Oftentimes, you know, we might get EPA funds. If it's a very small percentage, let's say, you know, it's 98% travel homes and 2%, you know, ineligible, then we might allow an in-kind contribution. So you don't have to pay any cash necessarily, but maybe you can say, okay, we'll let the contractor store their equipment in a gated area for no cost, or we'll forego our travel administration fees. You know, basically there are ways that, you know, we can allow an in-kind contribution to go forward if an ineligible contribution is needed. In the process, if you do need to document an ineligible cost, say basically, you know, 80% we're asking for IHS to fund, this other 20% is ineligible, so we're going to come up with the funds somehow. Then we need a letter, could be an email, typically a letter from the tribe saying that. We're going to come up with the funds, we're applying for outside funds, you know, we're trying to get the funds to make up this other 20% to represent, you know, the share for the 3 tribal facilities and the 1 commercial facility, for example. And we would accept that. But then whenever our funding is available, which typically be March of next year, so several months later, at that point, you know, you don't have to have, whenever you give us that letter in June, you don't have to say, we definitely have the money. Just say, we're hoping to have the money. But if by March of that next year, whenever we have our Indian Health Service funds available, then at that point, you have to say definitively, yes, we have the funds available. And if you don't, the project will not receive IHS funds, it'll get passed over. We don't require an ineligible cost share if all of the ineligible users together are less than half, the equivalent of like half a home. And we see this sometimes. You might have 20 homes and 1 tribal facility, and that 1 tribal government facility just has like 3 or 4 people working there in 1 bathroom. It's not using a lot of water. You know, we would not necessarily, you know, not require a ineligible contribution for that situation. And there's also if there are buildings that are used for assemblies and meetings of tribal members, if that cost is incidental to the project, then we wouldn't require a cost share for that. There's a whole lot of nuance here that I don't have time to go into in depth because there's kind of a lot to discuss here, but I'm just giving you a flavor of some of the things we have to consider whenever we put projects into SDS. So SDS is typically, for direct service tribes, is typically populated by Indian Health Service. Actually, typically, it is populated by the Indian Health Service. But everything that goes in here is an extensive process of working with the tribe to get tribal input at every step in the process. Now, if you're a self-governance tribe, then I'm going to be talking a lot about this process in the coming slides in the context of, IHS does this and the tribe does that or whatever. But if you're a self-governance tribe, whenever I'm talking about the IHS, that's going to be you for the most part. So for self-governance tribes, you have to put in your own data into SDS. And all the attachments that go into it, that'll be your responsibility. So keep that in mind. I'm going to talk about this as IHS does this and the tribe does that. But if you're a self-governance tribe, then consider yourself doing the IHS share of the process as well. So now I'm going to talk more about the process. Like I said, This is based on self-governance tribes, or I'm sorry, on direct service tribes. Self-governance tribes, it would be, they would have all the IHS responsibilities. So here's time frame. Collaboration. There's a lot of different steps in the process. What are you typically going to see? So there's a lot of variability. Here in Region 9, there are 4 different IHS areas in Region 9. You have California area, Phoenix area, Navajo area, and Tucson area. So this process may deviate a little bit here. I tried to make kind of broad windows because this is more or less the process everybody follows, but each area has their own process, and the specific details may vary from area to area. So, and a few places I'm going to talk specific details, and I'll focus on California because that's where I'm at. That's what I know. But it's generally pretty much the same process, but some of the details may be a little bit different. So typically, sometime around the January, February, March timeframe, your tribe might receive a letter from the district office or from the field office basically saying, hey, we're going to update SDS. Here's a list of everything we have in the system right now. What new projects do you have? What needs to change about these existing projects? It's kind of a heads up. It's time to update SDS now. Typically in the March-April timeframe, you might meet with the IHS field engineer. They'll come out, they'll go over things with you. They might follow up with a phone call if there's not a lot of, a lot in SDS for your tribe. If there's plenty of projects, they'll almost certainly come and show up in person and say, okay, here's the projects we have. What's changed? What's new? Do you have new things you need to put in? The IHS engineer may also have ideas about things that need to go into SDS. Over the course of the last year, I noticed that your well is having a hard time keeping up. Or, hey, I noticed that your lift station failed last year because it's getting really corroded. We need to put that into SDS. So it's a collaborative process. No IHS engineer should be putting anything into SDS without talking to the tribe first. So then in the April and May timeframe, that IHS engineer is starting to put more information about it. He's already consulted with the tribe by letter, in person, talked about what needs to change about the existing projects, what new projects need to go in. So now around this April to May timeframe, that IHS engineer will be, creating the document, updating all the information, trying to make sure that everything is as accurate as possible, and then checking in and saying, okay, this is how things are looking right now. What are your priorities? And there will oftentimes be some back and forth between the tribe and the IHS engineer about, making sure that the cost is accurate, or making sure that the scope of work is what the tribe wants. What makes sense to be a tribal priority. So the tribe can name their top 4 priorities. I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but sometimes you might want to be strategic about it. I'll talk about that more, but so that's the process. Around this May-June timeframe, again, at that point, the IHS engineer needs to be really wrapping things up, making any final corrections, and then getting the tribe's top 4 priorities in writing. So, there are points assigned for tribe's top 4 priorities, but they have to be in writing. You can't just call and say it's A, B, C, and D. Once upon a time, an IHS engineer would be allowed to say, I had a phone call with such and such person on such and such day, and they said the priorities are 1, 2, 3, 4. Headquarters is not allowing that anymore. Have to have it in writing. In the July, August, September timeframe, you're going to have review of the SDS project and maybe some follow-up by the area office. So the area office is going to be reviewing and saying, okay, explain to me why this is, this project isn't documented well enough. The tribe should submit still needs to submit a tribal priority letter, back and forth with the district and field offices. And of course, that might also involve some back and forth with the tribe to get these SDS projects in order and meeting headquarters guidelines. And then finally, in this September to October timeframe, IHS headquarters says the same thing. They review all the projects, and they do literally review every single project in SDS. We just got their comments back, and they were probably, out of 108 projects in California, there might have been 5 they didn't have a comment on. And I don't think it's like we did a bad job. I think they just do that to everybody. And again, based on their comments, we might have to come back and make some other, little revisions. So I want to say, look, this calendar is pretty much the whole year, right? And B, so all this process, from January, you have outreach, March, April, May, you're getting the project's developed, you finalize it in June, July, it gets reviewed in August, September. We won't get the funds typically until February, March of the following year. So it's pretty much a year-round process. So I kind of talked about this already. The first thing you'll receive is some sort of initial outreach. Typically that will be a letter. What you see here is a tribal input form. That's just used in California area, Phoenix area, Navajo might use different things, Tucson area. But what are your needs? What are your deficiencies? Give us as much information as you have. At the same time, you on kind of a separate but parallel process, the tribal utility consultant or the district utility consultant for the Indian Health Service might be talking to you about scoring your O&M organization, your water utility, your wastewater utility, or if you have one, solid waste utility. And so it's part of SDS, but it's also a little bit of a separate process of how that's done. And I'm not going to talk about that in great detail, just a little bit today, because just for lack of time. So what do we need in this process? Obviously, tell us what new projects need to go into SDS. Tell us what updates need to be made to the existing projects. And then this happens quite frequently. Tell us what projects need to be deleted. Maybe you got funding from another grant agency, and so you've already got it funded. You don't need it in SDS anymore. Maybe you have new leadership and that community sewer system is no longer a priority. You don't want it in SDS anymore. So there's different ways they can go, but we can delete projects from SDS, but we don't ever delete them automatically. We only delete them if the tribe wishes for them to be deleted. IHS needs, as I mentioned before, your top 4 priorities in writing. Typically, we're going to be asking for that around the May, June timeframe. And then the other thing is we have this home inventory tracking system called HITS. I mentioned it before. We basically, it's like a dot on the map for every native home that we know about. We don't keep personal information about the homeowners, just about the homes. Well, if you have things that have changed, you've built new homes in the last year, you have homes under the housing authority that have been conveyed, that's really important. You've had changes in ownership where you have a home that was a non-native home, but then now it's owned by a native person or vice versa. And we need to hear about that because that goes into our HIT system, and that kind of factors into everything else down the line. Okay, if you come away from this with nothing else but this, then this is what I really want you to come away with. Whatever you put into SDS, that the deficiency needs to be very thoroughly documented. It is, if there's one thing that we always have, not as good as we need, it's that, documenting that, it's one thing to say, our pump is, pumping too much, right? It's having trouble meeting the demand. It's very easy to say that. Well, prove it. How long is it pumping? Do you have an hour meter? Do you have operational records? Is it decreasing in yields? Do you have some records to back that up from your monthly operating report? If water quality is the issue, like you having, E. coli hits, or you're having arsenic, we need to see lab tests. Don't just say you have it, but send a copy of the lab test. The sanitary survey can be used. Photographs, I can't say enough. Photographs really can go a long way. Meter readings, a letter or a memo. There's so many different ways that it can be done, and it really varies a lot from project to project. But it needs to be quantitative and it needs to be definitive. If you say our water storage tank is rusty and leaking and we can't keep water in it because it's leaking all over the place, well, first thing I would do is take a picture of it, because that should be easy to see in a picture. Second thing I would do is, show me your monthly operating reports. How much water are you producing, if you have that? And even better, if you have that, and then you also have your meter readings right here. For every meter, you can say, we're pumping, 150,000 gallons a day, but only 75,000 of it's going to the homes. The other 75,000 is getting lost. So we either have a leak or it's coming out of this leaky storage tank. Something like that would really go a long way. And the documentation, I've seen this sometimes, it should be relatively recent. If you send documentation about a water quality issue in 2013, somebody's going to say, well, is that still a problem? Do you have a more recent test than that? So keep that in mind as well. Just a second, I'm going to have a drink. So other things that need to be documented. Contributions. So I mentioned earlier that if you have a portion of the project that serves ineligible users, non-native homes, commercial users, commercial facilities, government buildings, that sort of thing, you need to have a letter or an email or something saying that we're going to come up with the contribution for those. But if on top of that, if you want to provide contribution beyond that amount, say, okay, maybe we only have 10% ineligible users, but we want to contribute 25%, well, that additional 15% more to get you from 10% to 25% will actually count toward a contribution score. I'm going to talk about that more whenever I get to the scoring part. But the point is, again, you can't qualify for that unless you have that contribution documented in writing. In the case of, and I mentioned this before as well, in the case of if you're applying for another source of funds, let's say you're putting in an application for EPA drinking water funds or USDA rural development funds. If you're applying for it and you tell us you're applying for it, send us a copy of your application or just send us a letter saying you're applying for it. At the time that we put the projects in SDS, that's all we need, because we know the timeline of one grant program and the IHS program and everything, they don't always align. So you don't need to have the funding confirmed in the June, July timeframe whenever you're providing this letter. But then 8-9 months later, whenever it's February or March and IHS gets its funds and we say, okay, show us your contribution. If you don't have the funds at that point, then we'll have to pass the project over and we won't be able to fund it. And like I said, the tribe's top 4 priorities need to be documented by letter or email. So based on the deficiency, the tribe and the IHS engineer will work together to develop the scope of the project. And the project needs to be specific. Don't just say we're going to put in water main down Cloverleaf Lane and then up Main Street. That's not specific. You need to have, if you're putting in pipeline, you need to have a map of where you're going to put it. And you need to say what's the diameter and what's the material that you're planning on. Now at this point, you don't have to have a full plan set. We're not at that level. But you need to know pretty well, what size pumps you're going to have. Are you going to have a 5 horsepower pump or a 25 horsepower pump? Are you going to have an 8-inch water main or a 12-inch water main? Is it going to be 3,250 feet? It doesn't have to be on the dot exact, but you need to have a pretty good idea. You know what I mean? If I know I'm going down from this intersection of Cloverleaf Lane to this intersection of Main Street and so forth, then you should be able to measure. And when I say you, in this case, it's going to be the Indian Health Service engineer doing this for the most part, if you're a direct service tribe. You need to have a pretty good idea what it is you're building, right? You need to have calculations. You need to have sizing, hydraulic modeling, if that applies. So while the IHS engineer is doing all this stuff, the tribe needs to be involved. You know, what if, if you put it on the north side of the road, there's maybe some cultural properties we're going to disturb. So we need to put it on the south side of the road. Oh, we've got a landowner here who won't give us an easement, so let's put it on the opposite side of the road. Like, we need to know those things, and it's like, as I said, it's a collaborative process. If the IHS engineer is preparing the drawings and is preparing the documents, what he or she can do is only as good as the information he or she gets from the tribe. So it needs to be a lot of back and forth, a very collaborative process. And another really important thing here is, does the utility have the capacity to take care of the facilities? Are we proposing a treatment system that the tribe can't afford to run because it's just going to be too expensive? Or is it impossible to find an operator who's a grade 4 or whatever because, it's such a complicated process? So that also needs to be part of the conversation. Whenever we're talking about building something, it's not just putting some pipe in the ground and putting a treatment plant there and then walk away. The tribe needs to understand what it needs to take care of it and plan ahead, and IHS needs to be working with the tribe to make sure that those things are done. Again, IHS can't perform O&M on the system. That's going to be the tribe's responsibility. But IHS can do everything in its power to set the tribe up for success. So what do you need? At the end of the day, what do you need for a project in SDS? So if you think it has a chance of getting funded, you have to have a preliminary engineering report, like an engineering study, an evaluation of project risk. In California, it's called a PDP, or a project development plan. Other areas may do it differently. A detailed cost estimate that's within about 10% of final. It's got to be pretty detailed. You got to document the deficiency. I mentioned this before. If there's a contribution, it needs to be documented. Tribal priority points. The tribe needs to document their top 4 priorities in writing. It's pretty hard to get a project funded without tribal priority points. It could happen, but it's harder to do. For a solid waste project, solid waste projects are kind of a different animal. I'm not going into a lot of detail about that. I did discuss them in more detail at the presentation I gave a couple weeks ago. And that presentation is online. That was Wednesday of 2 weeks ago. But for those projects, you need to have an integrated waste management plan and a capacity evaluation prepared by EPA for solid waste projects before they can get funded. And from area to area, there may be other requirements that they need in SDS before a project can be funded. Now, projects that are not likely to get funded, they still need to have an up-to-date cost estimate. They still need to have documentation of deficiency. They don't necessarily need to have quite this much information, but we need to know that there's a real issue, there's a real deficiency, and that there's a fairly accurate and detailed cost estimate, not at the same level of accuracy, plus or minus 25%. There's also a third category I really didn't mention here called Tier 3, which is like basically just like we don't really have a clue. It's a wild guess. There's really almost nothing required for it, and it doesn't count into the funding plan. It doesn't really count for much of anything. But what the value that it has is it's a placeholder, right? We don't even know what we're dealing with here, but we know there's some need for something here, and so we're putting this as a placeholder until we can put more effort into developing it. Okay, planning. So IHS cannot put into SDS a project that is only for planning. Planning needs to be tied to construction. So you need to have a project that has planning and construction involved in it. Now, if you have a project that doesn't have really, much risk to it, activities, maybe a little bit of surveying, some environmental compliance, but we're not really anticipating any problems, then what will happen to that usually is we won't fund the planning and the construction separately. We'll fund them all at once. Planning, construction, everything, all just in one go, and then do the planning, and then we'll do the construction. However, if you have a situation where you have a pretty high degree of risk, such as we're going to drill a well, and we don't know where we're going to drill it, we don't know how deep it's going to be, there's a lot of risk there. You don't know if you're going to be drilling 300 feet or 800 feet deep. You don't know if you're going to be 200 feet from your pump house or 2 miles from your pump house. So something like that, there can be a lot of variation. So in that sort of situation, IHS can fund activities, but it still has to be tied to a construction project. So in a situation like that, let's say you need to do a hydrogeological study and maybe do a test hole drilling before you put in a permanent community well, then you're going to have a project for the whole community well and the new pump house and everything, with the plan being that you're only going to fund at first the planning. And then once you do this hydrogeological study and you do the test hole drilling and you know where you're going to drill the well, you have a pretty good idea what the water quality is going to be. Then at that point, you would fund the rest of it, which is the construction funds for drilling the permanent well, casing it, putting the pump in it, et cetera, et cetera. So, sorry, my mistake. Water quality testing considers that as well. Or if we had very unusual environmental compliance issues, then we could fund that in advance as well. So if you have a situation like that where you have a project that needs to be done, but there are some huge risks, talk to your local engineer and ask about how we can get funding for these planning costs. Because funding for planning doesn't really come through SDS, but you have to, basically you have to ask your local area, and if they have a little bit of extra funds left over at the end of the year, that's where we have funding that we can use for planning. And why do we do it? Because we need to make sure we're budgeting properly. If you don't know if that well is going to be 300 or 800 foot deep, you don't know if it's going to be 200 feet away or 1 mile away, then how can you budget for it? All right, so I'm going to talk about SDS Project Scoring. There's 8 different scores here. I'm going to talk about them here in just a minute. Theoretically, you can go up to 108 points. Usually, again, this varies a lot from area to area. You know, if you're over 50 points, you might be in funding range. At least that's true here in California. It might be different in Phoenix, or Tucson. So I'm going to talk about them in detail. The health impact is really based on, you know, do we know that there has been a disease outbreak, or how likely is it that there could be a disease outbreak because of this project? The deficiency level is actually defined in the legislation in the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. So deficiency level 5 or 4, 5 means you don't have any water supply or any wastewater disposal system. DL4 means either or, means you don't have water or wastewater. Deficiency level 3, something that doesn't apply with local pollution control laws. Deficiency level 2 is basically infrastructure improvements that meet the law, but there's things that need to be corrected. And the deficiency level 1 means there's really no deficiencies. There's one scoring factor called adequate previous service. It's a pretty small, 4 points.
I think our presenter got kicked out. He kind of thought this would happen, so we're going to wait a few minutes while he gets back in.
And we will answer some questions toward the end of this presentation. When Jonathan gets back in, I can let him know there's some questions waiting in the chat box, and he can address those when he's available to do that. Vanessa, would you like me to bring up his presentation so that's ready for him when he signs back in?
Yeah, I have it up as well, so I can screen share. I know he just got back in. Jonathan, are you able to hear us?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, you're good.
Oh, okay. I was afraid that's what happened. Nancy or Vanessa, does one of you have my presentation up?
Yeah, I have your presentation up, and just to give you a heads up, you have about 15 to 20 minutes left of your presentation. I know you wanted to save some time for questions. There are some in the chat box, but for now, I'll just walk through your slides, and you can take those when you're ready.
Okay, excellent. I can't see the slide that we're on right now. Okay.
It's other scoring factors is, I think, where you stopped.
Okay. Okay, I believe I was talking about the adequate previous service score. So that one, it's not used all that often, but basically if you have homes that have never been served at all by any federal funds, then they would get some amount of score. You have the O&M capability score, which is a 0 to 16, based on basically how well prepared your utility is to run the water, wastewater, or solid waste facilities. The capital cost score, I'm going to talk about that in the next slide, but so I won't go into a lot of detail, but that does vary a bit from area to area in how it's calculated. The tribal priority score, I mentioned this before, but basically, you send us a letter documenting your tribe's priorities, and then it's 16 points for the first, all the way down to 4 points for the fourth. And then finally, you have this other consideration score. Not used that often, but if you had a project that was really not ready to fund and it was somehow ending up in the funding range anyway, then it basically allows a negative points to be included to drop a score down. It's not used that frequently. Next slide, please. So on the next slide, we have the capital cost scoring table. Everybody see that? That's the example from California. And I won't go into a lot of detail, but there's basically, depending on what the deficiency level of the project is, whether it's water, wastewater, or solid waste, and then what the cost per home is, that score can vary a lot. That used to, from -9 points to 9 points. And at -9 points, if a project is that low, let's say in California, a deficiency level 4 water project that's more than $66,000 per home, then that project is economically infeasible. It would not receive any funds at all. It would be ineligible for funding. It would be economically infeasible. Next slide. So how do we go from scores to a list? Basically, I explained to you how the process works, of how the scores work. You know, we identify the deficiency, we submit the projects, and then, you know, there's a lot of back and forth as, you know, the original project gets put into the system, it gets reviewed by the area office, and then it gets reviewed again by headquarters. But whatever the score of that project is in early November, that's when the snapshot is taken. And that snapshot is basically, we're freezing it in time, nothing else can change. And then whenever we get our funds from Congress next year, and like I said, in the February or March timeframe, this is the prioritization we will use to distribute those funds. Next slide, please. So just as an example, this is the publicly available information for the top of the list for 2020 in California area. Obviously, it would look different in Phoenix or in Navajo or Tucson. And this is all the information, by the way, that's publicly available. It's not a whole lot there, but that kind of shows you what the list looks like. You see the contributions, that's typically, you know, what needs to be contributed for ineligible users. Next slide. All right, I'll talk about funding distribution real quick. Next slide again. So the funding distribution, like I said, we fund in priority order. Sometimes a project needs to be passed over. Typically, the only reason that would be is either A, if, you know, a contribution was required, but then, you know, the tribe couldn't come up with the contribution, or B, if the tribe already received funds from another source and therefore didn't need to, you know, didn't need the project anymore. EPA Clean Water Act also funds in priority order, and we basically, IHS and EPA funds are just distributed down the list from top to bottom until the funds are run out. Next slide. Excuse me. So you might say, why is my project not getting funded? I've had this project in SDS for 4 years. Why is it not getting funded? Well, there could be a lot of reasons for that. Maybe you have the deficiency is not documented well enough, or more planning is needed. Maybe it's just not a very high health impact or a deficiency, or it's too expensive on a per home basis. Maybe you don't have a tribal priority letter, or maybe your O&M organization, meaning your water utility, your wastewater utility, needs to improve. Or it could just be, it's just too competitive. There's a lot of other tribes requesting those funds, and it's a competitive environment. Point being, some of these things you have control over, and some of them you don't. So the ones I have highlighted there in italics are things that you do have control over. You know, more documentation of the deficiency, telling us your tribe's priorities, improving your utility. You know, that really goes a long way. It helps you in the long run too. Next slide. So I'm going to go briefly about the funding trends over the last 5 years. IHS regular funds have increased substantially over the last several years. EPA funds have remained flat. There was you see a bump up there. Those numbers there are specific to California. There was a bump up for California, but I think overall Clean Water Act funds have remained pretty stable. But IHS funds have gone up substantially. And the problem is IHS funds for projects have gone up substantially, but funds for actual engineers have remained flat. So essentially what we were doing is we're giving our same engineers double or triple the workload, but we're not giving more engineers to make up for that. Next slide. However, even with this substantial increase in funds, we're still only funding in California. We funded about 8% of the total need last year. Or if you talk about feasible need, you know, let's take out the ones that are economically infeasible. It's still only 13% of the need. There's still a lot of need out there. So this increase in funding is really helpful. It used to be we only got 2% of the need funded every year. So if we're getting 8% or 9%, that's a huge improvement, but there's still a long way to go. What's the future hold? I mean, I don't have a crystal ball. I can't really tell you. But I can just say that I like that we're getting more funds, and we'll see what happens. All right, next slide. I have a few more slides. I want to have time for questions. Next slide again. Okay, so what can you do to improve your chances? Work with your local utility consultant to improve your O&M score. Whenever a project is being developed for SDS, ask for O&M equipment and training. Ask for tools, ask for safety, personal protective equipment related to the project, of course. Ask for things to help with develop the capacity, an O&M plan, a safety plan. Make sure that the SDS project includes training on how to run those facilities. So IHS doesn't have a whole lot of funds. We've gotten a lot better lately, but still a very large project such as reservation-wide community sewer will probably require a multi-phase, multi-agency approach. So don't, you know, even with these huge increases, California area got $9 million in a year to serve 104 tribes. So, you know, keep the scale of funding available in context. Next slide. This is a timeline. I kind of already talked about this already, so I think we'll just go ahead and skip this one. Next slide. This is pretty much just a summary of whatever I said. SDS is a database. It's used to distribute IHS Regular funds and EPA Clean Water Act funds for drinking water, wastewater, and solid waste projects. Each project is based on a documented deficiency and a well-developed solution, and it's a collaborative process between IHS and the tribe. And documentation is critical. And funding is relatively scarce compared to the need for funds. So don't be offended if your project doesn't get funded. You know, it might take a few years. Next slide. And I'll end on this slide. This is just the names of the contacts for each of the areas. The SFC directors, SFC is Sanitation Facilities Construction. So these would be your primary area-wide points of contact about SDS. And I also have links here to the STARS website and the SFC website. And that is the conclusion of whatever I had. I'm sorry I'm a little bit running over time, but I want to see if anybody had any questions.
Jonathan, let me stop sharing here and then I can get to the question box. I'm not sure if you can see that at this point or not. Let's see. So we had a couple of questions about the HITS database and about STARS. Some of this you may have answered as we went through the presentation, but I'll start with the kind of multi-part question about HITS. How do we find out what homes are listed in HITS, and how do tribes work with IHS to add new homes to HITS or revise incorrect data in HITS? You talked about that a little bit, but maybe give a little more detail.
So I would say that is a process that you need to sit with your local IHS engineer and go through it with them. And depending on how, if you have a relatively small tribe with, let's say, 20 homes, they might be able to print out some sort of a map that you could use and compare with your own map. But if you have a larger, you know, land base and you have several hundred homes, you might actually need to sit down side by side with them or virtually now these days over a Skype meeting and kind of go through, you know, and you can ask, show me what you have in HITS, and at the same time, whatever things that you know about new homes being built. If you've got GIS data, that would be fabulous. If you don't have GIS data, but you've got an aerial overhead, sort of just an image, that would be great. But whatever information you can give to that IHS engineer, you know, will definitely help.
Okay, great. And then the next question is, how can tribes receive a training in how to access and use WSTARS to review their data contained therein? So
the data, typically what we do for direct service tribes is we will get all the data and print it out or print it out, when I say print it out, but, you know, make files of it and email it to you to review. If obviously, if it's a self-governance tribe, they have full access to stars. They input all the data themselves. On an area-by-area basis, you can request read-only access. And if a tribe requests read-only access, the policy about read-only access where you have your own account and you can log into stars and look at it, but not necessarily alter it, but just see it like with your own eyes instead of just whatever the IHS engineer sends you. That varies from area to area. I think some areas will allow it, but you would have to request it from the SFC director on that last slide I showed.
Okay, and then just a couple comments. Rob Roy posted in the chat box a link to the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. And Rob just wanted you to know, Jonathan, giving you kudos for your presentation both today and a couple of weeks ago. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Rob. I appreciate it.
And that looks like it's it for the questions in the chat box. We do have like 4 minutes left. If anyone has other questions, they can put them in the chat box, or we can unmute you for if you do have other questions that you would like to speak to.
Again, I want to apologize to everybody. I kind of gave Nancy and Vanessa heads up. I said my Wi-Fi sometimes goes out here, so luckily they were on the ball and had my presentation ready to go. So I'm sorry I dropped off like that.
Well, we were ready for that. Thanks for the heads up, Jonathan. It doesn't look like there's any other questions in the chat box. So if you want to just wrap up with any final thoughts.
No, I would just say, anybody here, if you want to, I would encourage you to contact your local IHS field engineer, district engineer, whoever is your point of contact. But if you don't know that person well, or you just want a new perspective or whatever, I would encourage anybody, feel free to contact me if you have any SDS questions at all. I didn't put my email address here, but you see what the format is. It's the same format. It's jonathan.rash. So it's JONATHAN.rash, RASH, at IHS.gov. So anybody here, feel free to send me an email anytime. If you want more in-depth or you want to just have a discussion about how it works or whatever, I'll be happy to do that. And there's no questions, and I want to thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan, and thank you everyone for attending. I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting now. So thank you guys. Have a good rest of your day.
Take care.
Thank you.